Welcome back. In this lesson, we'll be building out pagination in our Vue 3 application. So by the end of this lesson, here's what it'll look like. You can see we've got our previous and next buttons, and it loads up the events based on what page we are on. We'll be starting where our real-world Vue 3 course left off with our events application and building out pagination. If you want to follow along as we build this application, I highly recommend it. It can be a good learning experience. You can click the link below this video in the lesson resources or use this URL to get over to GitHub and either clone this repository or make sure you're in the L3 start branch and click download the zip file. Every lesson will have a starting branch. In the case of this lesson, it'll be L3 start. And if you want to check the ending code, you can check out the branch L3 end. We've got 6 steps to build out pagination. First, we'll modify the event service API call to take the per page and page parameters. Then we'll parse and set the current page from the router using function mode, as we saw in the last lesson. We'll modify the event list component to pass on page number to the event service API. We'll add pagination links to the event list template. Then we'll only show the next page link when there is a next page. And finally, we'll improve the pagination styling so it looks pretty. Let's jump into it. Our mock JSON server uses this endpoint. And if we look at the server documentation, we see that we can send in an underscore limit parameter, which is how many items to return per page, and an underscore page parameter, which tells our API which page to return. So if we call our API with this URL, it'll return 2 events per page, and it will give us the 2 events on page 3, returning a JSON string which looks something like this. Inside our application, we'll jump inside of our services directory and open up the eventservice.js. This is where we do API calls. We'll give it a per page parameter, which is the events to return per page, and a page parameter, which is the current page we're on. Then we'll build the URL string, setting the query parameters. Done with that step. Up next, we'll parse and set the current page from the router using function mode. If we want to see page 2, this is what our URL would look like. What we want to do here is get this query parameter if it exists and cast it from a string to an integer, otherwise default it to page 1. We'll then send in this page as a prop into our event list component. Back inside our code, we'll go into the router directory and open up our index.js. Here inside our routes, we'll add props, route, and then create a JavaScript object where we define the page property. And if the page exists, we'll parse the string to an integer. Otherwise, we'll return 1. Next, we'll jump into our event list component. So inside views, we'll open up event list. And inside here, you can see our template up at the top, which lists out all our events. Then we'll specify that this component receives a prop called page. Then, inside of our created lifecycle hook, we'll send in the argument 2 as our events per page, and then we'll pass in the current page as an argument. We'll then start up our server. If you're running it for the first time, make sure you run npm install first. Now, if we jump into our browser, we can see it's loading 2 events. And if we go to page 2, it should load 2 different events. And it does. And then we go to page 3, and yep, it loads up 2 more different events. Great. Next, we need to add pagination links to the event list template. So here at the top of our component, we'll add a router link. This goes to our same event list component with the query parameter of the current page -1. This is going to be the previous page. So for SEO purposes, we'll put rel equals previous. We'll only display it if we're not on the first page, and then we'll display prev page. For our next link, we'll copy and paste it. We'll do page +1 to navigate to our next page. Say rel equals next. We'll take out this VF for now because checking for the next page is a little more complex, and we'll do that later. Great. Now if we jump back into our browser, we have our links, and if we click on them, looks like they're kind of working, but our components aren't updating. This is a problem. And this is happening because our create lifecycle hook is only called when the component is initially loaded. And when we go to a new page, Vue is smartly reusing the component. But when it reuses the component, it doesn't call create again. So we need to work around this. The question is, how do we make another API call when page gets updated? There's a few ways we could solve this, and I mentioned 2 in the lesson text, but here we're going to solve it using a new feature of Vue 3. Back inside of our component, we're going to import the watch effect function from Vue. Then inside our created lifecycle hook, we'll use this watch effect, and we'll simply allow it to wrap our API call. Now, when reactive objects that are accessed inside this function change, Vue will run this function again. And in this function, we access page, which is our prop, which is reactive. So when this changes, the API should get called again. I'm going to add one more thing though before we test this out. I'm going to set events equal to null. This will clear out the events on the page so our user knows that the API has been called, and when they click next, it looks like something's happening immediately. And when we jump into our browser, now when we click next and previous, we can see that our API is getting called appropriately. All right, next problem to solve. We only want to show the next page link when there is a next page. To do this, we need to know how many total events we have. And luckily, our API call returns a header that contains this information. So all we need to do when our API call returns is set our total events using this header. Then we'll use this information inside a computed property we'll call hasNextPage. This will get the total number of pages by calculating total events divided by 2 and rounding it up using math.ceil. Then we'll return if this page is less than total pages, specifically if this page is not the last page. Then back up in our template, we want to display the next page only if hasNextPage. Now if we jump back into our browser, we can see that when we get to the last page, next page disappears, as it should. Wonderful. Our last step is to just make it pretty, and there's nothing fancy here. I'm not using Vue Router, just using basic Vue stuff, so I'll go through it pretty quick. I'm going to wrap our router links in a div. I'll give each of them an ID, and I'll change the router text to be like this, previous and next. And I'm going to paste in some styles. I'm just using Flexbox, nothing fancy. Back inside our browser, you can see now we have these nice looking previous and next links that work. That's all there is for pagination. If you wanted some extra credit, you could try adding page links. So it says previous and then pages 1, 2, 3, and then next page. It's not going to be that difficult now that we know how many pages we have. Either that, or I'll see you in the next lesson where we'll talk about building nested routes. The code we're using, we'll be starting where our Vue